The day the world almost ended. Nuclear close call hidden for 40 years. November 26, 1983, was an ordinary day for most of the world. People went to work, children went to school, and the endless churn of the Cold War carried on in the shadows. But in a cold, dimly lit bunker just outside Moscow, the fate of millions hung in a fragile balance that no one outside those thick concrete walls would ever know. Colonel Stanislav Petrov sat rigidly in his chair, eyes fixed on the flickering screen before him. The Oko early warning satellite system, a series of Soviet satellites designed to detect missile launches by scanning for heat signatures, hummed quietly as data streamed in. This was the latest line of defense against a nuclear strike, the first warning system meant to give the USSR precious minutes to respond to a US attack. For weeks, tensions had escalated. NATO was conducting Able Archer 83, a massive command post exercise simulating nuclear war scenarios. The Soviet leadership had been on edge, fearing that the exercise could mask a real attack. The atmosphere in the bunker was thick with dread. Petrov glanced at his colleagues, young officers who had been trained to respond swiftly, without hesitation, to any threat. But Petrov had been in this role long enough to understand that the machinery of war was prone to error. Technology was not infallible. Human judgment was the final safeguard. As the clock struck 0:14 Moscow time, a sudden beep shattered the silence. On Petrov's screen, a red warning blinked urgently. Missile launch detected. His heart jumped. A single heat signature, rising from U.S. territory, appeared on the satellite feed. A lone intercontinental ballistic missile had been launched. But something didn't add up. Petrov knew that a first strike wouldn't be limited to a single missile. It would be a massive volley aimed at crippling Soviet retaliation. He looked to his deputy, Lieutenant Colonel Yuri Dubov. Yuri's face was pale, his fingers twitching nervously on the control panel. "Are you sure?" Yuri asked. Petrov nodded slowly. "The satellite says yes. But this could be a system error." Before he could ponder further, the alarm sounded again. 2 more launches. 3. Within seconds, multiple missiles appeared streaking towards Soviet territory. The room erupted in controlled chaos. Officers scrambled to alert their superiors. Protocol demanded immediate retaliation orders be prepared. Petrov knew the protocol, knew what was expected of him. But the unthinkable truth weighed on him: this might not be real. The ground radar, the trusted system meant to confirm satellite data, showed no incoming missiles. The data was inconsistent. Petrov's mind raced. He was a single man, tasked with a decision that could start a global nuclear war. The air in the Serpukhov 15 bunker grew heavy with dread. Petrov stood up slowly, not in panic, but with the weight of realization pressing down on his shoulders. Every second stretched like an hour. He could feel the eyes of the other officers on him, waiting for an order, a signal, a move. "Colonel," Yuri said, voice breaking slightly. "We have 5 confirmed launches according to satellite data. We need to notify higher command." "I know," Petrov replied, his voice calm but firm. He turned back to the screen. 5 missile launches. If they were real, they would reach Soviet soil in roughly 25 minutes. Retaliatory action had to be launched within 10. But why only 5? The doctrine of nuclear war was brutal in its logic. A first strike from the US would not be a surgical effort. It would be thousands of warheads, not a handful. 5 missiles wouldn't cripple Soviet command or destroy second strike capabilities. It made no strategic sense. Unless it was just the beginning. His stomach turned. If he hesitated and it was real, he would be complicit in the destruction of his country. If he acted and it was a mistake, he would be complicit in ending human civilization. Petrov moved to a secondary console and called up supplementary telemetry. The heat signatures were strong but lacked depth, the kind of data a seasoned eye could distinguish. It didn't feel right. Not to him. "Ground radar still shows nothing," a junior officer said, his voice cracking with tension. "No confirmation." That was the tipping point. "Do not report this as an actual launch," Petrov said. Silence. "But sir," Yuri began, his hand trembling above the communication terminal, "protocol." "I said do not report it." The junior officer looked confused, scared. "Colonel, if this is real..." Then we'll all be dead in 30 minutes, Petrov said flatly. But if I'm right, we just saved the world. He reached over, toggled the response report on his monitor, and manually input, false alarm. No confirmed threat. No action required. He signed it. Then he sat down and waited. The next 20 minutes passed in excruciating silence. Each tick of the clock echoed in the bunker like a funeral drumbeat. Some officers sat frozen, others paced. Petrov remained still, eyes locked on the screen, ignoring the sweat trickling down his back and the tremor in his hands. No missiles came. No explosions. No blinding lights in the distance. Outside, Moscow continued to sleep under its heavy gray sky, oblivious to the razor's edge they had just skirted. When the radar feed ticked past the 25-minute mark with nothing but digital snow, the weight in the room lifted slightly, but only slightly. Everyone knew what had just happened. But no one said a word. Hours later, when the morning shift arrived, Petrov was escorted from the bunker and brought before a panel of higher-ranking officers. They asked the same question in various forms. Why hadn't he followed procedure? "I trusted my instinct," he said, seated stiffly across from General Sokolov, a grim man with deep creases in his face from decades of war. "Instinct," Sokolov repeated, tasting the word. "We built this system to eliminate instinct. With respect, General, no machine can think about intent." "You were wrong. You could have been wrong," the general barked. "Yes," Petrov replied. "But I wasn't." The general leaned forward, eyes narrow. "You disobeyed a direct responsibility. You violated the chain of command." "I stopped World War III," Petrov said, barely above a whisper. Silence. Eventually, he was dismissed. There would be no medal. No commendation. Only silence. The incident was buried in a classified report labeled "System Error, No Action Taken." Officially, nothing had happened. Petrov returned to his regular post, but something had changed. He was no longer trusted, not quite. His name floated in bureaucratic whispers, and when his reassignment came months later, it was to a desk job in an administrative unit outside Moscow. He didn't argue. He never spoke of that night, not to his wife, not to his friends. What was there to say? Years passed. The Cold War ended. The Soviet Union dissolved. Still, the story remained locked away in the vaults of state secrecy. But secrets have a way of surfacing. In 1998, Russian military historian Oleg Gorbachev, no relation to Mikhail, was combing through Cold War records for a book on nuclear policy when he stumbled across a curious report. It was dry, clinical. Early warning system detected 5 U.S. ICBM launches. Radar confirmation failed. No escalation triggered. Operator classified event as false alarm. Gorbachev knew what that meant. Someone had overridden the protocol. He requested further documents. Most were redacted, but the name remained: Colonel Stanislav Yevgrafovich Petrov. 2 years later, Gorbachev tracked Petrov to a modest flat in Fryazino, a small town northeast of Moscow. He was retired, thin, quiet, and reluctant to speak. But eventually, he did. The story broke in 2004, first in academic circles, then in the press. Western media dubbed Petrov the man who saved the world. Documentaries were made. Historians re-evaluated 1983 as the closest the Cold War ever came to going hot. Petrov watched it all from his living room. He didn't attend the screenings or interviews unless pushed. He didn't seek the limelight. "I did nothing special," he told a BBC reporter in a rare interview. "I just didn't want to be responsible for millions of deaths. That's all." But that wasn't all, and the world knew it. He had made a decision under unimaginable pressure. One that changed history. Years later, when asked what he felt in those minutes between the satellite alert and the moment it became clear the world would not end, Stanislav Petrov would always pause, letting silence speak first. He would never dramatize it. Never boast. The truth was that he had been terrified, not in the way action movies depict, with shouting and adrenaline, but a deep, still kind of fear. The kind that makes your hands go cold and your breath flatten until you don't even realize you're holding it. The West called him a hero. He bristled at the word. Heroes ran into burning buildings or pulled comrades off battlefields. He had just sat in a chair, trusting a gut feeling that could have doomed him and millions more if it had been wrong. Still, recognition came, belated, unofficial, but real. In 2006, the United Nations Association of the USA awarded him a special citation. In 2013, he traveled to Germany to receive the Dresden Peace Prize. The halls were full of applause, cameras, handshakes, and long-winded speeches, but he seemed out of place in the limelight. When he took the podium, his speech was short. "I am not a man of politics," he said. "I am a man who did his job. And that night, my job was to stay calm and think. Nothing more." The applause was thunderous. Still, he did not smile. He would later reflect that the award ceremonies felt more surreal than that night in the bunker. It was easier to believe in the logic of a nuclear launch than to accept that history had chosen him, a colonel buried deep in a secret installation, to make the call that would save humanity. Back in his apartment in Friazino, he lived modestly. A dusty television sat atop an old wooden stand. His military coat, neatly folded, lay untouched in a cabinet. He spent his days feeding the birds, writing in a leather-bound journal, and sometimes sitting by the window watching the birch trees sway. Occasionally, a student or journalist would find their way to him. They came with notebooks, cameras, reverent eyes. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you had followed protocol?" one young reporter asked. Petrov didn't answer at first. He poured tea from a chipped ceramic pot, stirred in 2 cubes of sugar, and stared into it like it might reveal something new. "I think about it every day," he said finally. "It wasn't courage. It wasn't defiance. It was doubt. Cold, paralyzing doubt. And in that moment, doubt saved the world." He went quiet again, as if the words had taken something out of him. The reporter waited, but no further explanation came. Years later, after Petrov passed away in 2017, the news barely made headlines. There were no state funerals, no monuments, just a trickle of tributes from those who understood what had almost happened. A man with a terminal in front of him, 5 blinking dots on a screen, and 10 minutes to decide whether Earth would burn. The incident was revisited in historical circles, taught in war colleges, dissected by political scientists as one of the most important unknown moments of the 20th century. It took decades for official documents to be declassified, for the full scope of Able Archer 83 to be understood. How close NATO came to unknowingly triggering a Soviet response, how thin the veil had been between peace and global annihilation. The deeper historians dug, the clearer it became. No missile had ever flown. It had been a false alarm, sunlight glinting off high-altitude clouds, misread by the Soviet satellite's infrared sensors. The Oko system had failed. The protocols had failed. Only one man, with no special tools other than his experience and his instincts, had stood between civilization and oblivion. It raised uncomfortable questions. How many other near-misses had there been, buried in archives? How many times had the world dangled over the edge of destruction without knowing it? In the end, Petrov's life became a lesson, not just in history, but in the fallibility of systems, the danger of blind obedience, and the extraordinary power of human judgment. He was the anti-hero of the nuclear age, a man who did not press a button, who chose not to escalate, who held the line not with force, but with hesitation. And that hesitation, that sliver of doubt, became the barrier between life and death for billions. Perhaps the most haunting part of his story is how quietly it all happened. No headlines, no explosions, no countdowns, just a blink on a screen, a quiet decision, and the world kept turning. In the decades that followed, generations were born into a world that never knew how close it came to vanishing. They lived under peaceful skies, went to school, fell in love, argued, danced, invented, explored, never realizing that one quiet man in a bunker, far away and long ago, had once looked into the abyss and chosen not to let it swallow them. The Cold War eventually thawed. The Soviet Union dissolved into fragments. The missile silos were sealed or dismantled. But the weapons still exist. So do the systems. And the memories, though fading, linger in the shadows of state secrets and dusty reports. And somewhere, in the small Russian town where he was laid to rest, Stanislav Petrov sleeps beneath unmarked snow. There is no grand monument, no eternal flame. But maybe, just maybe, the silence of peace is his greatest memorial. After all, it was the silence he preserved. The silence that almost wasn't. In the years after Petrov's story came to light, it seeped into academic curricula, documentary scripts, and late-night philosophical debates. He had become a symbol, an icon, albeit a reluctant one, of restraint in an age that often rewarded aggression. Some likened him to the fabled Roman general Fabius Maximus, who believed that doing nothing could sometimes be the most courageous act. The incident entered nuclear policy debates around the world, often mentioned alongside other Cold War close calls: the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, the 1979 NORAD false alarm, the 1995 Norwegian rocket incident. But Petrov's case stood apart. It hadn't required diplomacy or back-channel negotiation. There had been no charismatic leader on the phone, no backroom deal. Just a man, alone in a moment, deciding to trust his humanity over the system. There's an irony to his anonymity. The architects of the Cold War, presidents, premiers, generals, had their names etched into history books. Their speeches, their treaties, their military strategies were studied endlessly. Petrov, the man who arguably preserved more human life in a single moment than most of them combined, lived in a cramped apartment with a leaking roof. He never amassed wealth, never leveraged his fame. When a Western filmmaker offered him a share of profits from a documentary about his life, Petrov declined. He accepted a modest stipend for travel expenses and asked only that the truth be told accurately. In one of his last recorded interviews, he spoke softly into the microphone, eyes focused on something distant. People think saving the world is a dramatic act. It wasn't. It was a long, quiet night. The worst night of my life. A beat. And maybe the best. There was no certainty in his voice. Just honesty. He still questioned himself. Had he done the right thing? Had he gambled with lives he had no right to risk? But in that endless gray zone between protocol and morality, between war and peace, he had chosen life. In the modern age, his decision became a case study in ethics. Military academies discussed it not just as history, but as a live dilemma. Artificial intelligence researchers invoked his story as a cautionary tale. If our machines are tasked with protecting us, who watches them? Who second-guesses their logic? Because the system had failed. A cascade of coincidences, satellite misreads, flawed detection algorithms, heightened geopolitical tension, conspired to present false certainty. And Petrov's refusal to believe in that certainty saved everything. In 2022, a small group of international scholars proposed naming a principle after him: the Petrov threshold, a doctrine asserting that critical decisions with irreversible consequences require human skepticism and delay, even in the face of automated alerts. It gained traction in policy circles, especially among nuclear disarmament advocates and AI ethicists. A bust of Petrov was commissioned by a peace institute in Vienna, another in Geneva. But in Russia, where his story had first emerged, the government remained subdued. The official narrative never embraced him fully. Perhaps because he exposed a vulnerability in the Soviet command structure, or because his actions, though heroic, contradicted military doctrine. His grave remained modest. No military band played at his funeral. But visitors came. Quiet people. Engineers, historians, travelers. They would kneel, lay flowers, or sometimes old medals from relatives who had served in the military. A tribute not just to a man, but to a moment of grace. Over time, a tradition emerged, a candle lit each year on November 26th. Not in a church or a city square, but in silence, at desks, in classrooms, in control rooms, by satellite dishes and radar towers. A flicker of remembrance for the night when nothing happened, because one man chose to wait. The world has changed since then. New threats have emerged. Cyber weapons, rogue states, climate wars. But Petrov's lesson endures, that the systems we build to protect us can fail. And that sometimes, only doubt, humble, human doubt, stands in their way. It remains one of the most haunting what-ifs in human history. What if someone else had been on duty? What if the officer had followed the protocol? What if ground radar had confirmed a false echo? Would cities have burned? Would the world have plunged into nuclear winter? We'll never know, because none of it happened. That's the quiet miracle of Stanislav Petrov, a man who saw war coming on a screen and said, "No, no action, no panic, just judgment." And the world turned one more time, unburned, alive.